Welcome to session 15 of the Symbol course. In the first half of the session today, we will continue reviewing the skills training workbook's Mindfulness Skills module. In the second half of the session, we will introduce the fourth simple tool, which is rational mind remediation. Rational mind remediation is Simple's adaptation of cognitive behavioral therapy. We watched the introductory videos entitled Attachment Styles, How Good Were Your Parents, and Toxic Things Parents Say. Please go to session 15 on the website. It's simple2021.com. Next are our usual reminders directed mostly at people doing the course in a group. Please take a few moments to read these on your own. To watch this week's mindfulness practice video entitled Mindful Body Scan, please go to the website now. For people doing the YouTube course as part of a group, you can now pause for questions, comments, or feedback. This is what we will do today. In the first part of the session, we'll review the skills training workbook, pages 110 to 131. At the midway point, we'll have our usual break. We'll also have time for questions, comments, and feedback. In the second part of the session, we will introduce rational mind remediation. Please take a moment now to rate how well you think you did on your homework this past week. To watch a video on the DBT mindfulness skills, please go to the website now. Last week, we discussed what the mindfulness skills are. This week, we will review how to use them. This section of the workbook focuses on how to use wise mind and radical acceptance. Today, in our review of the skills training workbook, we will cover 1. Advanced mindfulness skills, 2. Wise mind, 3. How to make wise mind decisions, 4. Radical acceptance, 5. Judgments and labels, 6. Self-compassion, and 7. Mindful communication. Let's review what wise mind is. Wise mind gives us the ability to make healthy decisions. Wise mind requires that we simultaneously recognize two things: that we are in an emotional mind whole, and that we could have different thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Emotional mind urges us to make judgments or decisions based solely on how we feel. When we use wise mind, we make decisions while aware of both our rational and the emotional minds. It's easy to listen to emotional mind and be controlled by it. Rational mind analyzes facts and thinks objectively about the evidence. We have to distinguish well-regulated from dysregulated emotions. At times, this can be difficult. We should listen to well-regulated emotions, or we risk become overly rational in an unbalanced or unhealthy way. How to practice wise mind. Is wise mind intuition? Wise mind is sometimes mistaken for intuition and thought to come from the gut. Simple doesn't see wise mind as coming from the gut. It sees it as the self-observing prefrontal cortex that can see reason, emotions, and body sensations, and take all these into account in its choices and decisions. The skills training workbook describes a meditation to help you get in touch with your wise mind. How to make wise mind decisions. Check in with wise mind before making decisions. When learning to make good decisions, use the prompts below to help tell the difference between wise and emotional minds. 1. Were you mindful of both your emotions and the facts of the situation when you made your decision? 2. Did the decision feel right to you? 3. You can sometimes tell if you've used a wise mind by examining the results of your decision. Radical acceptance and mindfulness. We've already explored radical acceptance. You may be wondering how it relates to mindfulness. Mindfulness is the ability to be aware of your thoughts, emotions, physical sensations, and actions in the present moment without judging or criticizing yourself, others, or your experience. Radical acceptance means having an experience, especially a negative one such as pain, without judging or trying to change it. To be mindful of negative experiences, you must choose radical acceptance. When you judge or try to change negative experiences, that judgment triggers secondary emotional reactions, which further take you away from wise mind and its non judgmental acceptance. Radical acceptance is difficult to learn because it requires you to think about yourself, your life, and other people in new ways. But in the end, it gives you freedom as you spend less time judging and falling into emotional mind holes. How to practice radical acceptance? A, by reducing negative judgments. To reduce our judgmental thinking, we must become aware of when we are being judgmental. Use the negative judgments record on pages 117 and 118 of the workbook to keep track of your judgmental and critical thoughts throughout the week. Find a way to remind yourself to do this daily for a week. Use sticky notes, phone alarms, visual reminders. B, by practicing beginner's mind. As you're becoming mindful of your negative judgments, consider also your positive judgments, as these too can be problematic. When we engage in positive judgment, such as thinking someone is the ideal partner for us, we may be disappointed as no one is perfect. Radical acceptance requires us to be non judgmental. This includes positive judgments. The beginner's mind exercise asks you to record positive and negative judgments for 1 week. You can find this on pages 120 and 121 of the workbook. How do you develop a non judgmental attitude? So far, we've learned that judgments can occupy our thoughts and lead to disappointment, regardless of if the judgment was positive or negative. We've also learned that judgments prevent us from being mindful. Judgment diffusion is a technique for developing a non judgmental attitude. In the previous skill session, we learned about thought diffusion, in which we use our imagination to visualize our thoughts floating away. Judgment diffusion, described on pages 122 of the workbook, asks us to do the same thing, but this time with judgments. Choose a visualization that works best for you and follow the script to help let go of any judgments you are holding. Another technique for developing a non judgmental attitude involves pendulating between your judgments and the present moment. You can find the judgments versus the present moment exercise on page 124 of the workbook. This exercise helps us learn how to shift our attention between our judgments and the present moment. The object of this exercise is to help us recognize when we've become stuck in our judgments and how to ground ourselves through our five senses when we notice this occurring. How to develop self-compassion and mindful communication. First, self-compassion. To have compassion means recognizing that a being is in pain and needs help. Treating someone with compassion means meeting them with kindness and without judgment. For many of us, it is easier to be compassionate with others than with ourselves. There are many reasons we struggle to be compassionate with ourselves. However, none of these reasons are wise. Imagine a beloved family member or friend that comes to you feeling like they didn't deserve compassion. Would you agree with this judgment? In order to make changes in our life, we must learn how to be compassionate towards ourselves. Punishing ourselves doesn't help us make changes and often makes us feel worse. It will be easier to practice radical acceptance when we learn how to be compassionate with ourselves. Mindful communication. Our mindfulness skills are helpful when communicating with others. We'll explore this in detail in the interpersonal effectiveness module of the course. When we make judgments of another person, we are at risk of damaging that relationship and having unproductive conversations. One way to promote mindfulness communication is to turn you statements, which can be blaming and judgmental, into I statements. I statements evoke more empathy and understanding, allow you to communicate your feelings in a non-judgmental way, and allow the other person to meet your needs. To learn to do this, see the exercise Practice Turning You Statements into I Statements on page 129 of the workbook. Don't worry if this is difficult for you. We will come back to this in more detail in the interpersonal effectiveness module. In this second part of the session today, we are introducing the fourth tool, rational mind remediation, which, as I said earlier, is simple adaptation of some cognitive behavioral therapy techniques. If we were entirely rational beings, adults would behave like mature, reasonable adults. Sometimes that's not the case. Why do some adults struggle to do things expected of adults, such as having long term relationships, careers, being a part of a community, and being a parent? That's a great question. Those are some of the roles society expects adults to accomplish. Accomplishing them, however, requires healthy psychosocial development. First, let's explore what are the common adult psychosocial tasks. This is not to say that there's only one way to be an adult. These just happen to be some of the most common tasks society expects of adults. Some of the commonly expected tasks of adults are that they become independent, develop intimate relationships, start a family and become a parent, assume the responsibilities of managing a home, begin a new career or job, assume some responsibilities in the larger community, and create a social network of friends and coworkers. Why do some people not achieve these commonly socially accepted developmental tasks? There are many ways to live as an adult, and some people prefer and choose alternative lifestyles. Other times, people would like to accomplish these tasks but struggle to do so. To accomplish them, one has to have successively negotiated Erikson's early stages of personality or psychosocial development. Some adults struggle with the developmental stages of autonomy, industry, healthy identity, and intimacy, and may not achieve them because they mistrust, have significantly shame and doubt, guilt, identity confusion, and end up isolated from others. Struggles with psychosocial development are often related to emotional dysregulation and attachment issues, and at the root of personality issues. In simple, we try to understand these issues and help people repair them. One way to work on this is to fake it until you make it, or learn to behave as a mature adult would, rationally rather than emotionally. This is how rational mind remediation works. Rational mind remediation is simple adaptation of cognitive behavioral therapy. What does achieving or not achieving commonly expected adult roles have to do with cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the subject for today? Not achieving expected psychosocial tasks, according to psychodynamic theory, may be related to issues with the development of personality. From this follows that if a person has struggled to achieve some of these psychosocial tasks, it may help to understand personality and use skills, tools, techniques, and strategies, as we do in the Simple course, to change aspects of it. These changes may lead to the person being able to fulfill these tasks. Using traditional psychodynamic psychotherapy to accomplish this can, however, be a lengthy process. Aaron Beck, the founder of cognitive behavioral therapy, thought that cognitive behavioral therapy was a shortcut. Let's first consider who Aaron Beck was and how he came to this conclusion. Modern era was a child of the scientific revolution. It matured in the 18th and 19th centuries with Newtonian mechanics, coal being used as a power source, and the Industrial Revolution, as well as the American and French revolutions. The modern era was challenged by Marx with his economic analysis and Freud with the notion of the unconscious. These thinkers set the stage for postmodernity. Aaron T. Beck, born in 1921, was a pragmatic American psychiatrist who trained in the postmodern European Freudian psychoanalytical tradition, but never fully embraced it. His membership application to the American Psychoanalytical Association was rejected because of his unorthodoxy. Cognitive behavioral therapy, by focusing on the importance of the rational and conscious mind, downplayed Freud's postmodern views about the dominance of the unconscious and returned to a modern, more mechanistic psychology based on the primacy of reason. CBT's slogan is mind over mood. Beck's main criticisms of psychoanalysis were that 1, it took too long, 2, was not affordable for most people, and 3, was labor intensive. He felt that techniques focusing on the conscious, rational mind produced for many people superior and faster results. As we will see, when wisely used, cognitive behavioral therapy is a very useful and helpful model, but it has shortcomings. Can you tell us more about cognitive behavioral therapy and how it works? What is cognitive behavioral therapy? Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is a form of psychological treatment that has been demonstrated to be effective for a wide range of problems such as anxiety, depression, panic attacks, addictions, eating disorders, phobias, and anger issues. CBT is based on several core principles, including 1, psychological problems are based in part on faulty or unhelpful ways of thinking. 2, psychological problems are based in part on learned patterns of unhelpful behaviors. 3, people suffering from psychological problems can learn better ways of coping with them, thereby relieving their symptoms and becoming more effective in their lives. CBT treatment usually involves efforts to change patterns of thinking. These strategies might include 1, learning to recognize distortions in one's thinking that are creating problems, and then reevaluating them in light of reality. 2, gaining a better understanding of the behavior and motivation of others. 3, using problem-solving skills to cope with difficult situations. And 4, learning to develop a greater sense of confidence in one's own abilities. CBT treatment also usually involves efforts to change behavior patterns. These strategies might include 1, facing one's fears instead of avoiding them, 2, using role playing to prepare for potential problematic interactions with others, and 3, learning to calm one's mind and relax one's body. How does CBT work? CBT is influenced by Stoic philosophy. It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Epictetus. CBT focuses on the triad of thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. These 3 are closely linked and change together. Emotions are the most difficult of the 3 to try to consciously change, and often powerfully dominate thoughts and behaviors. Thoughts and behaviors are somewhat easier to consciously change, and CBT focuses on them in order to change feelings, inverting the usual order of influence, hence the name of the popular book, Mind Over Mood. CBT uses many different techniques such as relaxation, journaling, desensitization, setting of goals, examining cognitive distortions, guided discussions, and creation of rewards. Today, we'll talk about 3 core CBT strategies. 1, thought records, which are very similar to chain analysis and rational mind remediation, which we will talk about today. These strategies seek to identify and correct cognitive or thinking errors. 2, behavioral activation, which harvests the power of behavior to change feelings, and in some ways is like Simple's 5th tool, the goals diary card procedure. And 3, behavioral experiments, which tests people's negative predictions about the future in a scientific experiment-like fashion in order to adjust these predictions. Let's first look at thought records. This is a typical thought record template. Thought records are in many ways very similar to chain analysis, which is the 3rd simple tool. Thought records start with a situation that evoked dysregulation, look at the feelings that the situation triggered, and consider the thoughts associated with each of those feelings. Those thoughts were, of course, emotional mind thoughts. Thought records then ask what rational mind thoughts might have been in the same situation. It encourages the person to look at the situation from rational rather than emotional mind. It also encourages people to become mindful of the most common automatic negative thoughts and thinking errors that they repeatedly make. Cognitive behavioral therapy compares thinking to a tree. Our automatic negative thoughts are like the leaves of the tree. Our thinking errors are the branches. Core beliefs, which are our most deeply held assumptions about ourselves, the world, and others, are the trunk and the roots of the tree. Cognitive behavioral therapy helps people to become aware not just of their automatic negative thoughts and thinking errors, but also of their core beliefs. The second core cognitive behavioral therapy strategy we will briefly explore is behavioral activation. Behavioral activation is based on the principle that what people's emotions compel or try to make them do isn't necessarily what is going to make them feel better or thrive over the long run. For example, a person who is depressed typically wants to withdraw. Withdrawing, however, tends to make them feel even more depressed. Behavioral activation in a depressed person might, for example, involve scheduling some select healthy activities. If behavioral activation is done right, these activities, which the person doesn't necessarily want to do, but which they push themselves to do, will actually make them feel better. The third core cognitive behavioral therapy strategy is behavioral experiments. Anne, the nurse presented in the simple manual, did a behavioral experiment that's described on page 166 of the manual. Anne believed that she would fail in her new role. She was very afraid that Jane, her supervisor, secretly harbored negative thoughts about her. Knowing how competent Anne was, her therapist helped her design a behavioral experiment in which she sought feedback from Jane. Although Anne was very afraid of carrying out the experiment, she and her therapist rehearsed what she would say to Jane. Eventually, she was able to ask Jane for feedback and found out that both Jane and her employers were very pleased with her work. If you're thinking that thought records, behavioral activation, and behavioral experiments sounds a lot like what we've been doing already in this course, you're right. In psychology, there's a tendency for people to propose seemingly new approaches, which, when looked at closely, are recycled old approaches, presented using a different language. To recap, behavioral experiments are a CB2 tool for testing our thoughts and beliefs and replacing those that are irrational and harmful with healthy alternatives. What makes behavioral experiments so powerful is that we get to challenge our thoughts in the real world as opposed to just hypothetically. On page 166 of the simple manual, we give an example of a behavioral experiment which involved Anne, the nurse in the nursing home, that had a change in ownership, in which she solicited advice from supervisor Jane. Another example is offered below. To watch 2 videos about cognitive behavioral therapy, please go to the website now. If CBT is such an effective model, why are we doing simple instead of CBT? CBT is indeed a very effective approach, and today it is by far the most common type of psychotherapy that is practiced worldwide. I can remember when I started in psychiatry, psychodynamic psychotherapy was the most popular, and CBT was still relatively unknown. Cognitive behavioral therapy does, however, have some important limitations, which is why Simple adopts a psychodynamic model, which you might remember is the psychotherapeutic approach that was founded by Sigmund Freud, and which states that most of our psychological issues stem from the unconscious emotional mind. Let's look at some of the limitations of CBT. CBT focuses on consciously changing thoughts and behaviors in order to change unconscious emotions. CBT works best with people that don't have significant psychosocial developmental issues underlying their emotional dysregulation. Issues in psychosocial development are often related to insecure attachment and developmental or adult trauma. These give rise to patterns of feeling, thinking, and behaving, or personality, which are very automatic, ingrained, and difficult to change using only cognitive, rational strategies. Paying attention to thoughts and behaviors without focusing on emotions is like pushing the tip of the Freudian iceberg in one direction, while a strong underwater current pushes the submerged part of the iceberg in a different direction. CBT has tried to address this. For example, American psychologist Jeffrey Young developed schema therapy, which is a CBT adaptation for personality issues. In my opinion, schema therapy is not nearly as elegant or useful a map of the mind as are the attachment and trauma theory that we discuss in Simple. Why not just do CBT's thought records rather than Simple's rational mind remediation? It's difficult or impossible to do thought records while in emotional mind because thought records call for you to think rationally, which is very difficult to do while you're in emotional mind. To do thought records, you have to be in rational or wise mind, since those are the mind states that are able to come up with alternative thoughts. To do thought records, you have to be in or close to the window of tolerance. If you're too far from that window, you need to use crisis plans and distress tolerance skills before trying to do rational mind remediation. Just thinking of the situation for which they are doing the thought record triggers in many people a return to emotional mind. Hence, it's a struggle to come up with alternative thoughts. Even the most basic introductory CBT course lasts anywhere from 8 to 12 weeks. We can't spend that much time in Simple on CBT because we have lots of other material to cover. Rational mind remediation is a shortcut to doing thought records. It uses two dissociative techniques to achieve this shortcut. Rational mind remediation follows two algorithms. The first algorithm involves imagining you're helping a friend who has a problem that is very similar to yours. How to do rational mind remediation by imagining you're helping a friend. Start with your chain analysis. Imagine this was a friend's chain analysis and that friend has come to you for help and advice about how to use DBT skills to splice and paste a different outcome. How could your friend have seen or interpreted the situation differently if they had been in rational mind? Could your friend have thought or behaved differently to have a better outcome? Help your friend to imagine a scenario in which they had stayed better regulated. Help your friend to practice the situation in their minds using the editing, splicing, and pasting technique. Then, reclaim the situation as your own using the new scenario. Practice it repeatedly in your imagination. The second algorithm involves imagining what a friend who is well regulated would do in the situation for which you did a chain analysis. Once again, start with your chain analysis. Imagine that what happened to you happened instead to a friend who is well emotionally regulated. Imagine how they might have seen or interpreted the situation and thought and behaved differently. Imagine what they might have done and write this down. Reclaim the situation as your own and play it in your mind the way your friend did. Use the editing, splicing, and pasting technique. Practice that scenario in your imagination repeatedly. This is the template used for rational mind remediation. Notice the similarities to a thought record template. In the Simple manual, I provide 4 examples of how to do rational mind remediation. I suggest you look at these now. On the PowerPoint presentation that you will find on the website, there is a review and practice component that covers the tools, techniques, and strategies that we have previously covered in the simple course. Looking over those slides will help you consolidate the material. Let's look at the homework for this session. Thank you for spending this time with me today, and see you at the next session.